Again, my name is Tim Erickson. Welcome to Gulp for Beginners. We did, before we turned on the recording, we polled the people in the room a little bit about where they were at in their Gulp experience. We have a handful of people who, well, about half the room, I think, have at least used Gulp. A subset of those, maybe half of those, have actually edited or updated a file, and there's a number of people who've never used it before. Again, my name is Tim Erickson. I come from the Twin Cities. I'm also involved in Twin Cities Drupal Camp planning. I'd love to invite you all to Twin Cities Drupal Camp if you haven't been there before. If you have questions about it, ask me later. I have a small shop called Triplo. I have a couple of contractors who work with me. We're very small. I personally consider myself kind of a hacker in the back end. I do mostly either front-end development or project management. And even there, like, I work with SASS and CSS. I don't do, so I'm not a deep coder. And that's sort of what led me to do this presentation is, well, my goals for today are, for those of you who aren't using Gulp or who've been wondering what it was, to just make sure you can walk out of the room sort of understanding what it is and why it might be of value to you. If you're already using it, to maybe demystify it a little bit. Again, when I first started doing some presentations at camps, people said, hey, if you want to learn something, sign up to do a session on it and then dig in. And it wasn't, I had started to dig into Gulp just to demystify it for myself, and then I thought this would be a good session because I'm a beginner in a way myself that has broken it apart. To explain it to myself and explaining it to other people would be helpful. At any point, if any of you who have used Gulp before want to contribute to how you're using it with other tools or to put this in context, please do, because I think that's really helpful. I would feel successful today if I learned something from you folks today about Gulp or maybe how I'm not using it. Oops. The very basics of Gulp, what Gulp is a toolkit for automating painful or time-consuming tasks in your development workflow. Okay, so repetitive things that you have to do over and over. I think we're going to talk a few about what some of those things are. I mean, the compiling your SASS, things like auto-prefixing things, linting, we'll talk about that in a minute. Those are some of the kinds of things. But basically, Gulp is just a tool to help you automate things in your front-end workflow. I got here, and this, I think, from some of your comments can relate to this. I like Drupal, in Drupal 7, I liked Zen a lot. And Zen has come with, over time, the first versions of Zen I used didn't have any SASS built in at all. Then I got to Zen 0.5, they had Compass built in. And I learned that if I typed install Compass and Compass Watch, that it did these mysterious things that made my SASS pretty. But I never really understood how that all worked and didn't care because it was getting my job done. When we got to Gulp 6, I was very frustrated because Compass Watch didn't work anymore. Now I had to type Compass Gulp or Gulp Watch. Also it started doing a bunch of other things that I didn't understand, but didn't bother me because they were there. When I got to Drupal 8, I opened up the Bootstrap theme and wanted to work with that. And at the time, and this was quite a while ago, there was no SASS compiler built in. So for the first time, it was like, oh, I have to actually add SASS to to a theme if I want to use it. And I had to add, I think what happened was, according to my notes, it came with Grunt, but I'd already learned Compass and I'd learned Gulp. I didn't want to learn Grunt. So I went ahead and installed, figured out how to install Gulp into my Drupal 8 theme. I also do a lot of work with Backdrop, and I'm involved in the Backdrop community. Theming in Backdrop is very much like Drupal 7. The theming is a little bit different. Because of the way they do theming, there's a lot fewer contributed themes in Backdrop right now, and none of them, to my knowledge, include sort of tools like Gulp built in. And I'm actually, one of the things I'm hoping to do to expand my own knowledge base is to actually contribute a theme to Backdrop that actually has tools like Gulp built into it. A number of the things that, like, say, Zen would have had for Drupal aren't necessary in Backdrop. And then some of them, it's just not the target market. So anyways, that's a little bit how I got here and why I started needing to learn more about Gulp. It was I could no longer rely on the fact that somebody else had built it into my theme and I could just hit play. This is basically just re-saying, well, this, what it was saying is with the last Gulp project, I still have a project in Zen that uses the Gulp built in. And every time I type Gulp watch, and if you don't know what that is, we'll talk about it in a minute, this all would go by on the screen. And actually, this was a successful Gulp run for me, despite all of those red errors, because the basic setup for Gulp was checking for all kinds of style errors that I didn't care about. It was trying to lint things that I didn't care about. I was trying to do all kinds of things that I didn't care about. But at the end, it would say, your CSS has been compiled. I was happy, and I ignored the other 400 lines of messages. And that just didn't feel right to me. It's like, I should know what's going on here. I ought to be able to customize this and make it work. And then I sort of, once I installed Gulp myself, I had the opposite problem of now I got to get it to do those things that I want. It's not just eliminating things I don't want, but what are the things I do want and how do I get it to do those? I want to refer you, there's a blog post, and I have it open here, Drupal Theming 101 with Gulp. And this is a great blog post. If you've never installed Gulp, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this is what I used, and it's a great blog post that just sort of walks through the steps of installing Gulp. And basically, how many people are familiar with NPM package manager? Everybody? Basically, this walks through the process of installing. I don't remember if I used Homebrew or not, but basically making sure I had NPM installed, and then using the Node Package Manager to install Gulp into my theme. Initializing it. We're going to look a little bit at the theme file structure. Once you have creating your Gulp file, this is the key to a Gulp installation. We're not going to do all of this today, but here it is. And there's some little things like some customizations that I couldn't even explain to you exactly why I needed to do these, but they're just sort of some changes they're specific to Drupal, that why the default sort of Gulp install file doesn't work on Drupal, and you need to do this to make it work there. If anybody, wants to explain those to me right now, they're welcome to, but they don't seem too important, and I wouldn't worry about it. I think the last big thing in this blog post is then installing your specific modules, which is going to take me back to, where do I, there we go. Go back to my slides. I think my next, there we go. Some of the things for each task you want to do in Gulp, and there are hundreds of Gulp plugins. For each task you want to do, there's a plugin. Gulp out of the box is I guess it's called a task runner, is that right? Sort of a category. So it is, it's in a sense its own framework, right? Gulp doesn't do anything itself. It gives you the ability to automate a whole bunch of tasks, and you have to decide which tasks you want, and each one of those need their own code, and there's hundreds of options, right? Some of the obvious ones that I think people do most often and that we're most likely to run into our work is compiling our SASS. And how many people have not, or who's not used SASS before, or less? Just one? Two? Couple?
Actually, I haven't. I thought you were referring to something else when you said SASS.
Okay.
So no, I have not used SASS.
So no wonder you didn't understand my question. Yes, why you didn't understand my compilation question. So let me give you a brief, a quick definition of SASS. Although you may know what it is, but just in case anybody doesn't. SASS is a pre-processing or a way to pre-process your CSS that allows you to do things like nest CSS to create variables in your CSS, to create equations in your CSS, to like calculate. Some of these things I think you can, like equations, I'm starting to see that you can do in straight CSS. But Gulp gives you, or SASS gives you a few different, or some things like that. I think I don't think there's any variables in regular CSS right now. So I can define a variable.
Define a variable.
You can define it. You can or can?
Yeah, you can.
In just CSS?
It's standard CSS.
Okay. So I'm still, I don't know if anybody in here knows where the trends are going, if like SASS is becoming less necessary. I like to use Gulp because I also use it or SASS because I use it to nest things, where I put sort of rules within rules that wouldn't work in CSS, but Gulp processes those and creates the correct rules out of it. And I don't think I have time, although at the end, if we have time, if anybody's interested in that, we could look at it. I mean, has anybody heard, is it that like SASS is becoming less necessary?
I have not heard that.
No.
I did hear a rumor on Twitter the other day, so it must be true, that I think a future version of CSS will support some nesting.
Okay.
But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think mixins is a big thing you can do with SASS that I don't think is on the roadmap for CSS. Is that
Sure.
Can you summarize the comment for the recording?
Yeah. She was just commenting that that she's heard that nesting might be in the works for CSS. We've already identified that CSS is using variables, but mixins is something that is another thing in SASS. And what mixins are sort of like snippets of CSS that you might want to. It's sort of like a PHP include statement, right, where you put together a batch of CSS rules inside of a mixin, and then you can just sort of say include this mixin in any of your other CSS rules. That won't work in the CSS directly, but you put that in your SASS, you run it through a compiler, and the compiler generates CSS using that. So if you have a particular little batch of CSS you're using 20 times in your CSS files, you can change it once, run it through the compiler, and it changes everywhere. So less is just a different version of, it's a different language or way of pre-processing your CSS. I've only used SASS. I don't know that less is any better or worse. It's just, in Gulp is indifferent, it will compile either. So I'm showing you SASS today, but that's just because that's what I use. SASS does CSS and JavaScript or Gulp does CSS and JavaScript aggregation. For the most part, Drupal does that for us, but if you were setting up a Gulp file for a different project and you had 20 different CSS files you wanted to aggregate, you could rely on Gulp to do that for you. Compressing and minifying your JavaScript, optimizing your images, linting, which is just checking for style errors. A lot of those errors in that, when I ran Gulp, were style errors where if you're not supposed to use 0px pixels, that's a styling error, but it works. I'm not pure enough to worry about that, so my Gulp file was pointing out 100 places where I put 0px instead of just 0, and I just ignored that. Now I'm not recommending this. And
also show the depreciated code too.
What?
Warn you about
Yes.
things you're using that may be depreciated or not.
Deprecated, yes. Yes. So that's another thing it will do, warn you about deprecated code. I would actually, one of my goals is to actually use SASS to improve my style by paying attention to those errors. I'd like in the future to quit ignoring them and actually fix them. There is also, there is a sort of a rules file in SASS where you can go in and specify which things you want the SASS to check for. So for example, you might decide that you don't care about the 0 pixels thing, but you do care about having 2 spaces before a command or something like that. All these different stylers, and you can turn on and off the ones you want, and it will just check for the ones you want. Or, I think there might even be somewhere where like how fine you wanted to check. I can't think of any examples now, other than, for example, you can check for browser compatibility, and you can define like how many versions of the past browsers you want to check for. And you can actually tell it, check for the last 3 versions or the last 8 versions for compatibility. Any questions about the kinds of things? Or
what might add it too is,
yes,
then
please.
of course if you're committing on your Gulp.js file, then you can share it with anybody else. So if another front-end person's
Yes.
working on that project, they will be following the same rules and that kind of a thing.
Exactly. This can help you standardize your workflow across the team because you create these files, you can commit them to Git as part of your theme, and everybody is working under the same set of rules and processes. Anything else that anybody else does with Gulp? So there's hundreds of plugins and modules of things you can add to your workflow with Gulp. These are the kinds of things that I do most frequently. No, nothing else.
Oh, auto prefixer, but you mentioned that earlier, just as.
I did. That's not on this list, is it? Oh, okay. I think we're going to demonstrate that in a minute. So this is the basic process for getting started, and this is in some ways a quick summary of what we had in that blog post. We have to install Gulp. We need a Gulp file, and the Gulp file is specific to is what tells Gulp what to do. Your package.json file is what plugins you need. So you can just, in addition to like standardizing the rules, you have a package.json file. So when I commit that to my repo and Benji downloads it, he can just say npm install, and it will install exactly the same set of modules, the same versions, and on his machine to run Gulp. And then at the end, the last thing we need to do is, well, we need to install the plugins, and as we install each plugin, it automatically gets added to the package.json file. I'm going to look at both of these things in a second. So this is my package.json file. And basically, this just defines the installation. This is the big thing here, is it's saying which plugins we're using. So when I run npm install, it's going to go through and install all of those. Or if again, I'm not an npm expert, I think it's an update. You can do like npm update or something, or do you just do npm install again? Do you know? Like when you want to update your files.
You have to update it.
Okay. But that's, so.
Wait, so when you put your Gulp file together, did you specify all those different versions? Or is it?
Why is that happening? Okay. I used a rule that said, like, when I said npm install, let's see if I think I can do this. And I copied this from the blog post, but if I go npm install, there we go. Gulp SASS lint, it's auto-filling. Then there's this save dev at the end. And I'm pretty sure what that's saying is that I want to use the latest dev version. Does that make sense? Does anybody know this? I'm still learning. But that's sort of a clue. If I wanted to do a very specific, like I knew I needed a version of one of these plugins that was 2 versions back, I would type that in here and say, install that old version, and then my Gulp file would reflect that, or my JSON file would. If we go back to the, okay, we were looking at the screenshot. I believe the little up arrow or the caret before the version number is saying that or greater. So again, if you have questions about this, you can verify that this would be a
to do like greater than this but less than this too.
Right.
And I think it won't go to like the prefixers at 5.
Right.
The up arrow will be stay within 5.
Okay.
It will actually go to
It won't go to 6.
It won't go to 6.
There we go.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So that's defining basically the range, and you can be more specific or more general, however you want. That's just what I've been doing. So that's
I
it.
rarely change that. I mean, once I got a Gulp file working, it doesn't come up very often a lot of change a version of something.
Right.
Unless it's a specific thing,
Yes.
If it spits out something that says it's deprecated now, you might want to update it, but typically you just
Right.
happy it's working.
Yep.
Really,
Or if you hear there's a fancy new feature that you want to get a hold of, then you might.
You see how there are 2 sections, dependencies and dev dependencies?
Yes.
--save saves it as a regular dependency, --save -dev saves it in the second section as a dev dependency.
Okay. Good. So there's still things I'm figuring out about how this works. This is just the theme. So it was kind of a magical moment for me when I first realized I could build my own theme from scratch. Originally, I learned how to create sub-themes, right? I started with Zen. It had all this magic inside of it. I would create a little sub-theme and overwrite a few specific themes. But I ran into like Backdrop, where maybe I want to start a theme absolutely from scratch, and how do I add this? And this was like an example of a theme that's not necessarily a sub-theme, although it could be. But it's, you might be building it from scratch, and it's still pretty basic. It doesn't have any grid system or anything like that built into it. But it does have SASS, and that's the main thing. The node modules file, we wouldn't commit that to Git, because that, each developer can just run npm install, and the package JSON file.
Tends to get massive.
Right. Yes, I've noticed that. I have a site where we have a lot of sub-themes because we're using domain access, and I haven't quite figured out how to not install all the modules in every theme, and I got to figure that out. If anybody wants to help me afterwards. What else about this? So we have I have a CSS folder. Well, this isn't the live, this is a screenshot. We'll look at that in a minute. We're going to start without there being any CSS in there. In our SASS file, we're going to have some basic SASS files with a couple of really simple rules. The info file, that's specific to the Drupal. But the other thing here is our Gulp file. We want to look at a Gulp file. Why is that off the page? Okay. When you create a Gulp file, and we're going to look at a real Gulp file or a live one in a minute. This one's real. The first thing that the Gulp file does is just define what your plugins you're using. This is unlike the JSON file. This doesn't mean they're installed. And the reason we started a few minutes late was I had a panic attack when I ran Gulp 3 minutes before session start, and I got a bunch of errors saying that Gulp, none of these packages were installed. So I was quickly installing Gulp packages. For some reason, I was doing some cleanup on my laptop, and I think I inadvertently deleted these. So I just ran npm install for each one of these with that command that you saw, and reinstalled them. The Gulp is the basic thing. Browser sync, I'm still a little bit confused on this is something that I know comes with Zen. I think does anybody want to explain what this does?
Yeah, so although it doesn't work in my environments, but and I don't know why, but in theory, like it makes it so that as soon as you save your changes, the browser auto refreshes.
Oh, right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that never works.
No,
That's why I'm confused about it, because
it's vaporware.
I have got it working. I have got it working what I think it is, and then other times it doesn't seem to be working, and it just kind of confuses me. I think it does a few more things than that, but that's one of them, is like it just automatically refreshes your CSS for you. I think a lot of the times it's not working for me, so I just reload the page. You can build clearing the cache into your workflow, so every time you make a change, Gulp clears your cache, and you don't have to worry about that. So SASS is the basic tool we're using to create our SASS. Auto prefixer is going back and adding those prefixes for older versions of browsers. You don't have to worry about that. SASS will do all of that for you. Does anybody know what source maps are or use them? Yeah?
Well, it's gonna, the nice thing about SASS is you can really organize and be more component based when you're building off your nested SASS rules, and then when it all compiles, you get this giant CSS file, and you're inspecting it in the browser. You don't know what line of SASS you would go to edit that.
Right.
That'll give you a little comment
Right.
on each one. And there's also a way to do it as a separate file. You don't have to keep or you can't commit it, but that way, at least when you're comparing differences down the road, you don't get like a million lines of differences in your CSS just because you changed one line of code. But
Exactly, and I'm going to repeat that back and sort of show. So for those of you who haven't used SASS, one of the nice things about SASS, right, and you can do this with CSS as well, is to break your CSS into different styles. And I apologize, I don't, there are different systems for organizing your CSS and SASS. This was something I ad hoc threw together, so it may not fall into any system you've seen before. Like I have a CSS file for just or SCSS. And with SASS, I think you can get by with either of those. It's not a prefix, what is it?
Extension.
Yeah, extensions, SCSS or SASS, they both work. I've always used SCSS, but so these are some just sample ones that I have in here. They compile. Well, you can set your Gulp file up to either compile these all into one SASS file and then pre-process it, or vice versa. You can make a bunch of CSS files and combine that afterwards into one. But either way, you end up with one long CSS file in Drupal that has all of your CSS in it. Well, if you're doing a browser inspect and you want to know which rule you have to edit to change something, your browser tells you CSS line 1342.
Or says line 1.
Or line 1.
Compressed.
Yeah,
And sure, and that's not helpful. So what source maps does is it includes markup in the CSS file that shows where all of the SASS is coming from. So when I inspect in my browser, it tells me the line number and the SASS file where I can find my original work. And again, you would either manually need to generate those with a tool, or you can automatically pre-process that with Gulp. Auto prefixer, Gulp environments. Did I put that one in there? I don't remember what that one is. Anybody know what that is? Okay. Actually, there's a couple of things in here. I don't remember what notify is. I imagine it has something to do with messages that are being sent by Gulp. And then we actually have the Gulp SASS file or dependency. But those are some examples, many others. Any questions here? Okay. So I think we've looked at we looked at the structure. So I have basically the way I've set up and there are different ways of doing this, but I've set up my theme to have, right now it's an empty CSS file, and I have a SASS directory. I have a SASS directory, and I have a subdirectory for components, and most of these are empty, I believe, that I have. Oh, no, I want to go back to here. So most of them I just deleted all of to complicate things. I have a couple of simple things. And then I have a styles.css SCSS file, which basically identifies all of my component directories. And then when we run Gulp, it's going to find all of those SCSS files, compile those into CSS, and it's going to automatically generate a style sheet for me. And we're going to just go ahead and do that now. Well, first thing we're going to do, actually, I'm going to dump in sort of live mode. All Gulp is running commands, right? So I actually, first time I asked how to do this, somebody couldn't tell me, but I thought, what is the Gulp version of hello world? Just type hello, and I've basically created a Gulp task, which is to say hello Chicago. We'll look at the Gulp. We'll go back to the Gulp file, because that's going to show. Oh, okay, now it's too big. The last time I did this, that was the complaint afterwards, was me fumbling with trying to get. So here's the Gulp file we're working with right now. In the first task. So basically, this is JavaScript. If you know JavaScript, you're going to be more comfortable in a Gulp file than the rest of us. but you don't have to know JavaScript to know how to hack it, right? So gulp.task is just saying, hey, run, this is a task I want to run. We're setting, right here's the name of the task we want to run. Then we have the function here, which is actually, what we want to happen. And I'm just doing a console log thing. So again, when I run gulp, hello, it runs this task. If I want to actually compile CSS, and we're going to automate this even better in the future, but I created a task called simple SASS. So I can go back here and say gulp simple SASS. I run that. Gulp apparently has done some things. It says it's finished simple SASS. If I now go back to my directory, you're going to notice there is now a styles, a CSS sheet that wasn't there before. So it's taken all of my, and if I open it up in the browser, this is the window that. So maybe it has some. I don't know if it has anything to do with the way it was created, because SASS created it, or Gulp created it, that it won't expand. But I can't blow it up for you, but it doesn't really matter, because it's just, it's some CSS, and it's coming from multiple SASS files. If we go back, we go back into our SASS and we change, I'm not sure, the cats thing to red, and if I save that and go back and pre-process my SASS again, now if we go into our styles, cats has been changed to red. I would show this live, but I don't know that it's on a site, but I'm afraid that's going to break, and it's probably not important. So let's move on to some of the other things, just some of the other tasks we can put in our Gulp file. I keep forgetting. So here is another, basically a longer task. I was not very creative in my naming, and I called it SASS Test 1. I'm going to try making it a little smaller. Well, I don't know if you can see anything more, but it's I'm defining it by the name of SASS Test 1. It is creating and then returning a styles or a styles.sccs. Actually, that's what the source. We're defining the source of where we're getting our SCSS. We're passing the SASS through the SASS compiler. We're passing it through the auto prefixer, so we're going to auto prefix some things, and then we're generating a CSS file at the end. We'll just delete the existing. We don't have to delete it, it will overwrite it, but I think it's more visual if I actually get rid of it. Gulp. What was it?
Test 1.
Thank you. SASS Test 1? Yep. Oh, nope, that was the wrong name. Oh, that was the right name. So why did that not work?
You saved it? Did you save it? It's in the Gulp file?
Well, you're right. You're right. That's it. I did not. It had been commented out. I uncommented it and didn't save it. So there we go. It ran Gulp SAS 1, and now we once again have a CSS file. If we go down to example, it's now added auto prefixes. I didn't have any prefixes for old browsers prior to us running that. Let's see what else we got.
Did it add to the previous styles.css file, or did it replace the old one with a new one?
Okay, I deleted the old CSS.
Okay, so it created that.
So it created a new one. But if I hadn't deleted the old one, it would have just overwrote it. It would have, the existing one there's not a problem. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the SASS watch or the Gulp watch command in a minute, where every time I save a file, it automatically pre-processes, does all the tasks, and overwrites the file. And if you're using browser sync, will actually reload the page in your browser. And so you can just change blue to red, hit save, and your browser will be affected. You will see blue instead of red in your browser. I mean, within a few seconds.
So you don't want to like edit your CSS file directly. Your Gulp file is
Right. This is a good warning. Your CSS file is getting overwritten all the time. If you come into a theme that has SASS in it, and it's using SASS to generate the CSS or the CSS, yes, and you need to, know SASS or you're not set up, create a new CSS file and add that. I mean, there may be better solutions out there, but would be my quick hack, is to just create then a second CSS file with just your your stuff that isn't coming from SASS. I've run into that situations where I didn't have, I wasn't even sure how old the SASS files were, and so rather than mess with them, I just created a new CSS and added that. Any other questions or comments?
How important is the prefix? I haven't heard that, so is that less than 1% of users?
I would love for anybody in the room so the question is, how important is it to auto-prefix your CSS?
Depends on your client.
Yes, I think that's the
Your
right.
browser target, right?
Yeah.
Your device
Right.
target.
Yeah.
Depends on who your client is, and do they have specific, if I think it's really important if your client has lots of users on Internet Explorer or
If
something
the
like
client
that.
himself uses it.
Yes, or if the client himself uses Internet Explorer.
That's usually what it is.
I think,
Every day.
I know there are some people in the room that might be like, why is he even questioning this? Because for them, it's like an absolute imperative. I have to tell you that I often don't worry about it because my clients are small nonprofits their clients are generally using the Chrome and Firefox, and their CSS works fine, and I'm not doing real complicated things. I think it's also more important the more cutting edge you are, right? If you're doing kind of cutting edge CSS, you're more likely to have backwards compatibility problems and auto prefixing it.
Like Flex and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. So
It is automatic. I mean, that's the nice thing about Gulp.
Yes.
It does it for you. You don't ever think about it. You just
exactly.
add that.
So I wasn't sort of doing a lot of that manually, partly maybe because I'd like to think I was confident in Gulp doing it for me. When I built my own themes, I haven't actually added the auto prefixer plugin yet, but it is my intention to, because there's no reason not to do it when you can automate it. I'm sure that it also there's probably accessibility benefits as well. So it's
What's file size?
highly recommended.
The more of those you have, though, your file size will start to get big to
Yeah.
CSS file. But I think on your file, you also had it like going 15 versions back.
Yeah.
That's pretty far. So
Yes.
you can also kind of look up how old of a browser you really want to support. Is it IE 10?
Right.
Or is it IE 8?
I think I did that because if I put like 2 versions back, it wasn't giving me any. So I wanted to go back a bunch to make sure it did some auto prefixing. But yes, I could right there in the configuration say how far back I wanted to go. And how, so any other questions about that? So let's go back to our gulp.js file. The other thing we'll notice is I could run either simple SASS or SASS test 1. It will run either one of those. Let's do a source map quick. So I'm just uncommenting this. Let's see if there's anything. Yes, thank you. If there's anything in the JS here, again, I don't have to understand all of the JS here. If anybody wants to explain any of that, but basically it's piping my CSS files. Well, I think this is a little bit interesting because I have to tell, the source where it is, and basically I've got some wildcards there. So it's basically saying in these directories, any file that ends with SCSS should be pre-processed. And I have had problems where I imported maybe SAS files that were SASS, and Gulp was looking for SCSS, so it didn't find any files. I just had to change this in the Gulp file to fix that. And then it's in this case it's creating a source map file, and we'll see that in a second. And then it's writing it in the CSS folder. So again, we do gulp. We run that command. It happens pretty quick. We go back to the directory, and now we see in our CSS directory is the styles and a styles.css.map. And basically what happens is your browser reads that .map file, and that .map file maps all of the CSS to the proper SCSS files. Does that make sense? Okay, 15 minutes? 10. Better. Let's... I'm not like deliberately asking for questions because you're asking them as we go, and you should keep it up. I think probably the most important thing, so I have a few other, I have the, okay, I don't remember.
How did you know like the syntax for each of these plugins? Like, do they give you some boilerplate?
Copy and paste.
Okay.
Okay. If you know JavaScript, you could write this yourself.
Right.
I don't. So I did copy and paste.
You find that like on the
Yes.
project's
If you go to
documentation?
like, let's do this quick because I think it's worthwhile. If I want to resize my images using Gulp, right? I'm going to Google Gulp. Do they plug in to resize images? And I find Gulp image resize. This is going to be a package on npm.org, and I'm pretty sure it's going to give me the syntax for here, how to save that. You save it to your directory, and it will automatically get added to your JSON file, but you'll have to add it to the Gulp file if you're using Gulp. And then I think in most cases, if you go down, they're going to have an example code, and so you can then cut and paste that example code and tweak it. That's where I'm at still. So someday I'll be able to write that just because I'm smart. I want to go back to, I think probably the last big thing that's worth showing. Well, actually, let's do this one really quick. Linting. I'm just going to save that. I'm going to go to here and do Gulp linting. And so it's running all of the SASS, and it has generated a handful of errors, pretty much 2 of them. One of them, or 2 different errors, I think. Actually, a couple of them. That 0 unit that I talked about before, you're not supposed to have a 0px. You're supposed to, if you're doing 0, just do 0. So it's generating errors for each one of those. Rather than just tolerating these, I should just go do a search and replace and fix it, right? No trailing white space allowed. Anyways, so this doesn't change the actual end files, and in this case, actually I think this might have failed to generate the CSS because of some of these errors. And you can also, like, I could change in the configuration file, I can change, warn me about zeros, but don't generate an error, right? So I have that level of permission. Do I have that? And that's here in my SASS. Actually, I got to go to my editor. In the sass-lint.yaml, here's where you can see all of these rules. And there's, well, okay, it's not as long as I thought it was. Oh, okay. It's pretty long, but you can go through. 0, I think, is turning, well, again, our JavaScript, 0 is probably false, not running it, and 1 is true, that it is running them. You can do things like, on the 2, I'm assuming this is like a spacing or something, how many spaces you allow after a bang or before a bang. Okay, don't take my word for it. Look up the exact, the preferences and what each of those numbers mean. Style guide, that's something we haven't mentioned. You can automatically generate style guides. There's a module called, is it KSS? or KISS, KSS, that create style guides from your CSS. You actually have to just write some code into your SASS, and then when it will compile it and it will create a style guide sheet for you. And it's pretty nice. I found it. I didn't keep it up. So we did the linting. The last thing I want to show you is watch, because I don't want to have to, every time I make a change, I don't want to have to run gulp in a command. So there's one other thing. If I go down to my gulp, I can just do, I can define my default task. So gulp task default hello means that if I just run gulp, that's what I want to happen. So now I don't have to write hello, I can just say gulp. I probably didn't save it. Yep, I didn't save it. Just run gulp and it should say hello Chicago. There it is, hello Chicago. And I can add a series of tasks, and I'm going to do that for the final thing, which is my watch command. We done? 5 minutes left. Okay, perfect. I'm going to uncomment out my gulp watch, and this is doing, so gulp task, gulp watch is compiling my SASS, it's running some linting. So I think the wait, and I'm going to share this with you because I ran into a scenario where gulp by default will run processes in parallel. So I was running into a problem where it was compiling the CSS before it finished compiling the SASS. So I wasn't getting the right SASS because it would just generate a CSS file based on the old SASS and it wouldn't get my updates. And I added in this wait command. And I'm trying to remember, I would recommend Googling this, but be aware of that as a problem. So that basically I made sure that the wait allowed it to do the tasks in order in the cases where one task was dependent on another. And I'm forgetting what this line is about, but basically what we've done now is if I save this file, I can go back to my gulp and I can say gulp watch, and I hit save, and now gulp is watching for if any of my SCSS files change, it will automatically do all of those tasks I added. So just to prove it, because I don't know if you believe me, the styles is still, cats is red up here. If we're going to go back to here and we're going to change cats to purple, I'm going to just save it. I'm going to peek at my command line. Now, didn't I save it? I did save
Wait
it.
is not defined.
Yeah, I think the
Oh,
worst thing-
wait, that's the problem.
Oh.
Okay. Well, you'll all believe me, right? We're almost done, so I think I'm not going to try and fix this. But basically, this is the magic of gulp, right? You don't want to have to run this command each time. Although I know people who do, who have told me they consciously don't use wait. They prefer to run gulp when they're ready for it. I always use wait, or gulp, not wait, watch. I always use watch. Every time I save a SASS file, it recompiles my SASS for me, so I can go right back to the browser. I can save it, go back to the browser. I usually don't have the browser sync working, so I have to reload the page, but that's still really nice. Any questions?
What's the difference between gulp and compass? Compass.
So, I'm thinking that Compass was more targeted at specific kinds of things. It might be, can somebody answer that question?
I think it just compiles SASS.
It just does.
And this compiles, or does the lint and does various other.
You
Right.
have other plugins that can do it.
But it's weird, in a lot of my Gulp files that I've inherited, it runs Compass as a plugin,
Compass, I
so.
think, has
They're not
built-in
mutually exclusive.
functions too.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but it's not being developed anymore, I think is the.
Okay.
Oh, is that-
Now, my understanding is that Gulp and Grunt are like two different tools that do very similar things, but
And the
I'm
Gulp
here.
is the newer one that's replacing Compass.
Well, I think either of them would be considered an up from Compass, but I get the feeling that people are maybe moving more to Gulp than Grunt. That could be wrong.
It feels that way in Drupal anyway. Like, I mean,
Sure.
I think-
And I'm sure that Gulp and Grunt are the only ones that do this. There are other tools as well. But the Drupal community does seem to be kind of settled around Gulp for some reason. It works for me. I'm happy with
It
it.
sounds nicer than Grunt.
It does. Any other comments or questions? So, no? Well, you've been a great audience. Thank you for helping out and being interactive. Please give me feedback. Yep. I'd love